Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Of course, Jay is the proprietor of the recently resurrected Jay's Analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Jay'sAnalysis.com, right? You kept that.
Yeah, everything the same. It's just it's a lot better now.
So okay, now it's back up, and yes, it is good. I'm accessing the site, taking in some of the information there, and of course, you are the author of Esoteric Hollywood: Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, and also the soon-to-be-released Esoteric Hollywood II, right?
Correct. Early mid-December. I don't have a exact date yet, but as soon as I get a date, everybody will know.
So this is just in time for Christmas.
Correct.
That was the same thing a couple years ago, wasn't it? Wasn't it around Christmas time the book came out, or am I mistaken?
It was. Yeah, that's right. It was right before 2017. Correct.
Now, if they order it directly from your website, are you still doing the signing thing? Can we say that?
Correct.
Okay, cool. Look out for that then. Okay, so we will very much look forward to that in the coming month. I know I'll get my copy at least. Of course, at Jay'sAnalysis.com, you can subscribe. It's $4.95 a month, $60 a year.
It is, yeah. And I think the renovated site has helped the subscribers, so that's increased. Things are looking on the up, and yeah, we've got a pretty substantial archive. The only thing that still isn't fixed on the site is a lot of the old essays that I wrote, which there was a lot of those. Some of those are still broken links and kind of missing. So I still have a lot of old stuff to fix, which I do plan to do, but it's basically all up and running. So.
Okay, well, that's good. You pretty much up and running. I guess you irritated somebody or something, and the AI censor. I don't know who's doing this.
Well, there were certain topics, that pressure was put on WordPress to no longer be champions of free speech for.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it just seems like all across the board, a lot of these.
And I won't go too deep into it, but basically, it was an event a recent event, a big event. One of those kinds of.
Oh. Yeah,
you're no longer allowed to post on that.
Yeah, it's strange. It is strange because I had a couple videos on those events where it was either talked about or just
yes,
and they're 2-3 years old and they were pulled. So that is strange. It just because that topic, it begs the question. It really
right.
So anyway, well tonight you recently did a couple of videos reviewing some books that you have read, and recently you did a video called Cold War Propaganda and CIA's Doctrinal Warfare Program Using Churches, and you brought in this discussion an article you sent me a while back, and I looked at it briefly this afternoon, about some of the intrigues and manipulating divisions within the Orthodox Church, particularly with Greece and the Ukraine, and this is sort of perhaps geopolitical maneuvering against Russia. And then I guess this got you thinking about some of this other material that you've been reading, particularly David Wimhoff's book about the Catholic Church. And I'll let you take it from there about the sort of manipulation, this divide and conquer within religions, also manipulation within these churches, the doctrinal corruption of these churches through the intelligence agencies,
right.
Magazines, media, these things of the West. So go ahead. So what do we got here?
Well, yeah, I think also, too, another article that came out maybe a week or two ago was written by Neil Clark, he writes for RT, and Patrick sent me a really good article he wrote about the death of John Paul I and the Cold War, and it was really insightful. It was an interesting angle that doesn't really fit into the normative, Cold War style narrative of the death of John Paul that we usually hear. And even Western conspiracy-oriented books, have tended to paint that as some sort of KGB Cold War plot. But as Neil Clark argues in his excellent RT op-ed piece, that really only benefited the West. And I think if you look at it from that angle, that article harmonizes very well with what's in Wimhoff's book and some of the arguments that I was making in my talk and stuff that I was seeing and coming across just in my own experience, in the world of Orthodoxy. And, this is a very difficult, hairy subject in the 20th century, particularly with the the whole history of the the emigres, the White Russians being given solace in the West. If they leave the Bolsheviks, they were given, and there were different periods when the White Russians and others who fled the Bolsheviks were allowed to come to the West. And so one of the problems that this created was the idea that, oh, well, since the Bolsheviks are bad, that must then mean that the CIA and MI6 and these people that are inviting Russian refugees, I guess you could say, to the West, that must make them the good guys. And so there's a similar story then between what happened with my argument, or what I'm starting to see is a similar pattern, a similar story between the subversion of the Catholic Church in the 20th century through the means and methods of what Wim Hof describes, and what we're seeing in Orthodoxy as well. So certainly we agree that the Cold War was on one level bad news, but at a higher level dialectical manipulation. And certainly that doesn't mean any of the countries that persecuted religious institutions were good. Right? Mm-hmm. There are plenty of martyrs, plenty of people that were put to death by communism. So I'm not at all trying to vindicate that. But what we were sold was the story, which again, when you were giving your analysis of NATO and the paper that I think you said you'd written on NATO, you came to see that the justifications of NATO really ran their course, and they didn't. It no longer served its purpose, but yet it continued to have this offensive, this forward-moving operation against Russia. And even after the Cold War, even after when it supposedly ran its course, it's still surrounding Russia. It's still making these moves, and as many people have noticed, even E. Michael Jones, people who don't have the same views as me, people have independently kind of come to a lot of the same conclusions that wait a minute, what we were sold by these neocons in the Cold War, what we were told by these people at Rand Corporation, who's essentially the masterminds of the Cold War, has really led now to a situation where if you're not promoting globo tranny everywhere, right, you're an enemy of freedom. And so when I was really getting deeper and deeper into geopolitics back around 2012, 13, 14, I was watching color revolutions, and I was pretty heavily steeped in geopolitical issues by 2014 when the coup happened in the Ukraine. And I remember I just linked up with Patrick and was writing for 21st Century Wire, and I was noticing I think he had Mark Hacker on. That was before I actually knew Mark at the time. It was right around the time I met Mark. But I noticed that what Mark was saying about the Ukraine really lined up with what we see with the color revolutions and all the other countries where they've been promoted, especially the former Eastern Bloc countries. And again, what do we get with these color revolutions? Well, we get the introduction of all of the toxicity of Western countries, particularly of the U.S. Anglo-American Zio empire, essentially spreading, trannies and porn and disgusting degeneracy into all these countries that, ironically, had been, in a way, kind of guarded through the Eastern Bloc, through communism in a weird way, because they had opposed a lot of Western so-called freedoms. So there's just this really weird turn about the homosexuality being such a key issue in so-called freedom. And we know that, you and I know that we know that this comes out of like the Cold War, the cultural Congress of Cultural Freedom, the idea of promoting the freedom in the arts and all this nonsense. And that somehow that's connected with, freedom in gender expression, freedom in sexual expression, supposedly. And the reason I say all that is to say that, so when we look at the means of subversion in the 20th century through the big oligarchic families, one need look no further than the authorized biography of the Rockefellers by Collier and Horowitz, which I read extensively about 10 years ago, which was a big wake-up call for me, because I started realizing, wait a minute, this book is authorized. It's, you got the big neocon Horowitz in there. He's writing from the Rockefellers' authorized papers in history, and he's talking about how they funded the ecumenist movement for all these years, not because they really cared about religion, but to use it as a tool. And he talks about how, they set up the Council on Foreign Relations in America, in league with the Rhodes Milner roundtable groups in the UK. They set up the UN. They set up all these institutions that promote, globalism, so-called free enterprise, so-called free trade. And they're big promoters of all of this Jaffee, Memo, Barrelson type stuff. So you start noticing these patterns, and then you realize that now the subversion of American Protestantism, and I knew this because even before I had any kind of exposure or knowledge of geopolitics, and I'm not all claiming to be an expert, but even back when I was just interested in the religious realm and in theology, I learned as a Protestant that the Rockefellers and wealthy families had been putting a lot of money into certain seminaries, like Union Seminary, certain schools like Chicago University. And that was because they had an ideological bent. They really wanted to promote higher criticism, liberalism, et cetera, et cetera. So what I noticed back in my early 20s was that even some of the traditional, what are called Orthodox Presbyterians, there was a famous guy named J. Gresham Machen, and he left the mainline Presbyterian church, I want to say in the 20s, somewhere in there. But he wrote a book about liberalism, and he pointed out some of this stuff in his somewhat famous Protestant book on liberalism, saying, look, it's these big seminaries, it's the money that's going to these seminaries from these foundations. And so that was kind of my initial introduction to that idea. And then I started realizing when I would meet, people from Lutheran churches or from Methodist churches, and most of those mainline Protestant churches have kind of split off more conservative versions of them. And you would meet the people from those different conservative split off groups, and they would talk about, the seminaries got liberalized and blah, blah. So you started hearing the same stories over and over and over. And it just became evident. Well, so that's what's going on here. There's very powerful people. It's not just an organic thing of, we're all just liberal. I mean, there is a kind of cultural feedback loop there that does happen with people growing up in a liberal society, but there's also the top-down moneyed families putting certain people into certain seminaries. Fosdick, if I recall, is the guy who the Rockefellers put in place in the Presbyterian seminaries, because I think one of the Rockefellers was Presbyterian or something, and one of them was Baptist. Daddy Rockefeller was Baptist, I think. So essentially what they did was they created this idea of the social gospel. So a lot of people will say, the Jesuits became commies and they taught the social gospel. That's not exactly right. Actually, the Rockefellers came up with the social gospel. They promoted it in all of these seminaries, and it spread to Catholicism in the same way it spread to all the other churches. So the crux here is that there's a pattern, and the pattern is the same for all the churches, respective of what denomination you come from. And that's why Wim Hof's book is so good, is that this is the hard, straight up documentation from how this was done in the Catholic Church. And we're seeing the exact same thing being done in the Orthodox Church, basically. So that's the crux of the whole point, is that what you saw in the Ukraine, to tie this to the reason I brought up the coup in the Ukraine, is that in 2014, when they annexed it, from Russia, and they basically set up the CIA puppet there, it was geopolitics, it was money, it was all that kind of stuff out of Cold War strategies, or World War II strategies, because that was actually Hitler's strategy in the Ukraine, was to essentially set up its own little nation state there. And that's why they've had the sort of neo-fascist bent there. But it was also religious. So in order to wrest it from Russian influence, it's not just a matter of politics, it's also a matter of religion, church and state. So I was naive, back in 2013 or 14, when I was just looking at the geopolitical aspect of it, and I didn't think about the fact that, they're going to do the exact same thing in terms of the religious realm. They're going to want to remove the canonical church that's under the Moscow Patriarchate. They're going to want to also wrest that from the control of Moscow as well, because a sizable Orthodox population there obviously has to also be removed from not just political, but also religious influence from Moscow. That's the main point I'm trying to make here. So the way that relates to the U.S. is basically that the Moscow Patriarchate essentially severed communion with Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the Patriarch of Constantinople. So Bartholomew has been bad news for a long time, actually. A sizable portion of the church, the Orthodox world, has been very leery of him. Many believe that he is, in fact, a heretic. And that has only been made more and more evident, especially in the last few months, given the situation in Ukraine, with Bartholomew essentially saying that the puppet patriarch in the Ukraine named Filaret, who was basically installed as a puppet, who is known as a puppet. He's not canonical. Nobody's ever thought he was canonical. And suddenly Bartholomew essentially says, oh, he's the one there. He's the good guy. We're going to go with that. This made it evident to the entire world of Orthodoxy that Bartholomew was a stooge of NATO and the CIA. And so now we know why Joe Biden was meeting with Bartholomew. and now we know why Bartholomew a couple of years ago was giving Joe Biden awards.
And his son was involved in lucrative gas deals.
The gas deal, exactly. Yeah. Now we know why. And so it was all that, and it was all planning what just happened. So basically there's now a giant rift is widening in the midst of the professing Orthodox world, to the degree now that even Russian Orthodox Christians, or those under the influence of the Moscow Patriarch, and essentially all the other Orthodox patriarchs, agreed. I don't think anybody has sided, any of the major churches have sided with Bartholomew. The only people who have sided with Bartholomew are the Greeks in America, who are also directly under CIA influence. Yeah. So that's essentially what's going on. If you kind of know the basics, it's not hard to figure it out. It's all pretty clear. That's why John McCain was flying over there and meeting with the puppet patriarch Filaret, who, by the way, was a Soviet defector. His name is Dysenko, I think is his name. And he defected to the West, and magically he's the essentially the CIA puppet there in the Ukraine. So that's what's going on in simple terms. And I actually talked about some of this stuff. I wasn't fully aware of all the geopolitical stuff, but I knew that some of these guys are bad news. And I think really the last few months has vindicated my analysis of that whole scenario. So long story short, that's why this is all connected. And the subversion is happening because some of my analyses of these things over the last few months and years made a lot of people mad. They didn't know they thought I was being crazy, conspiratorial. And the reaction of certain people was to say, well, there's no such thing as foundations and institutions influencing the church, which is utterly preposterous, documented in multiple books. So I pointed out the fact that, Fordham University has a famous Eastern Orthodox Studies Institute there, and they just received a grant from some foundation in the UK to study gay and lesbian issues in Orthodox churches. So on top of that, Harvard has appointed social justice warrior trans people to spy on the Orthodox world and to report who are the radical right-wing extremists in Orthodoxy, on and on and on. So to say that this has nothing to do with foundations and foundation money is utterly absurd and ignorant. In fact, some of the people who claim this actually retweet the people from the foundations at Fordham, namely this Mr. Demokopoulos. I think his name's George Demokopoulos, who is the head of Fordham's Eastern Studies Department. So that's what's going on. And to think that this has no connection to, the CIA and that kind of stuff, it would be very naive. So that's essentially the essence of what's going on here.
Very interesting. Yeah, because Bartholomew was over there in Constantinople, which is Turkey, if I have my geography correct, right?
It is. It's NATO, correct?
Yeah, so it's a NATO country. He's also there's not much of an Orthodox population there anymore, so he's largely relying on the diaspora and Greeks, but also Western World Council churches, from what I understand, and
exactly
funding. So he has no independent base, and so he's being used. I also understood there is some sort of intrigue regarding this reconstruction of an Orthodox church, Greek Orthodox church in Manhattan, and the embezzlement of certain funds, and the U.S. government is backing off investigation, and this could be the sort of the leverage they have perhaps over some of these people, right?
That was very likely, but I've also been told rumant whisper intelligence is that people in those circles are compromised.
Yeah, well, that's wouldn't be surprising. It's par for the course. Yes,
correct.
And obviously, this is a way that can create a wedge, get in there, and this is another way of tearing Ukraine away from Russia and folding it into NATO and using the church the same way, perhaps the Cold War was used to suborn or manipulate the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Of course, the book you're referring to by David Wimhoff is John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition, How the CIA's Doctrinal Warfare Program Changed the Catholic Church. An essential, but probably the most important books I've ever read. Understanding the modern world, what's going on, and it's sort of fundamentally, at least it fundamentally changes, but it answers certain questions about what was going on in the 1960s in the Catholic Church and what's happened since then. So
right, and of course, the deeper you get into these kind of things, the less aware you are of how everyone else is not aware of these things.
Yeah.
So
that's another thing. You start talking about it, no one is aware of it.
And they're like, "What are you talking about? You sound insane." And then you point out, well, hey, wait, the government itself has actually investigated this, right? And then you point out the Reese Committee. And you say, hey, well, do you think the Reese Committee findings that was only for that time period? Like that never happened beyond we're going to quit now, right? Like MK Ultra. Oh, well, you investigate us. So okay, we'll stop. We're not going to do that anymore.
Well,
of course not.
Yeah, that's one thing. I just started a book called "Thy Will Be Done." It's about the Rockefellers and missionary in Latin America, and the tone is kind of lefty, but still important in the book. At least I haven't gotten too far in the book, but it talks about Fosdick and the use of missionary work and these things for securing the resources of particularly oil, but other natural resources of in Brazil and the Amazon rainforest and these things, and using these missionary groups as proxy soldiers, even unwittingly in many cases, but getting access.
Well, it's funny you said that because I was at an Orthodox church a couple weeks ago. I won't say which one, and I was very disheartened by the homily because there's two different priests there. One's kind of younger guy, and he usually gets pretty good, solid homilies, but the older priest is like a completely boomer tier neocon. And I was really distressed by this homily because it was basically because it was Veterans Day, so he was talking about how America basically guards world freedom. It was basically the four freedoms of FDR put into a sermon, and then he was talking about right after that he started talking about asking for money for some mission, and I was thinking, he was saying, I had a friend who, this guy, he was a doctor and he's given up everything to be a missionary. I'm thinking, oh yeah, right. He's probably working for somebody else. Now, I mean, I hate to be that cynical, but that's the mindset that you tend to think when you hear, a homily that sounds like FDR's four freedoms. And then I hear about a missionary needing money. I'm thinking, yeah, right. But, that's the sad state that we're in. And I'm trying to impress people. I'm trying to impress the point to people that this is cross-denominational because the oligarchs, the elite, the establishment, they're going to do what works. And if this has worked for decades now to subvert religious institutions, to turn them basically into organs of, the corporate state, which is what it is, then they're going to keep doing it. They're not going to stop doing it. And the reason it works is that people don't figure it out. People aren't aware that this is how religions are used. They're brought into institutions like you mentioned, like the National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, which are essentially Rockefeller institutions. And again, you'll get people who will analyze those things and they'll talk about, well, there was a lot of KGB at those institutions, and that's true. There were KGB that were installed in those, but it's like talking about Gorbachev. Who does Gorbachev end up lauding and praising and working for? Rockefeller institutions. And so, again, you have to understand that the big moneyed oligarchs are not at cross purposes with Sovietism or the KGB or Maoism or anything like that. They love it. They love those, control systems, those top down control systems, whatever titles you want to give them, fascism, communism. They all kind of achieve the same goal. There might be different flavors, you know what I mean? Like fascism might not be as degenerate as something like Bolshevism, but in the end, I would say that even fascism, is problematic because it basically deifies the state. And so in my view, what we tend to see, and in fact, as I was reading through Wim Hof, I'm simultaneously reading a book by, I think his name is Papianatsev. It's written in the 1890s, and it's memoir, Reflections of a Russian Statesman. And he was critiquing from the 1890s Russian statesman view, writing prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. He's critiquing Western liberal democracy from a Russian Orthodox perspective. And he's saying the exact same thing that the anti-Americanists are saying in Wim Hof's book, right? So the arguments of even Pope Leo, or writings like the Syllabus of Errors, or Quanta Cura, or Father Leonard Feeney, or Father, I think there's a guy in Wim Hof's book named Father Tapping or something like that, where there's a significant section of an essay that sounds just the exact same argumentation that the Papianatsev is giving about democracy, and how both of them, in fact, make the point that when you try to have separation of church and state, you don't actually get that. What you get is a state-controlled church.
Yeah.
That's the irony here, is that everybody who all of these people who are purveyors of separation of church and state, they're always acting like making this argument as if you're going to get the freedom that you really, really want if you just let us set up the secular, divide, and let's set up the secular situation. It's going to be freedom for you. We promise. Think of all the tyranny that you've had for all these centuries. And then what you get is this monstrosity that's just another shadow controlled, church state. That's what we have in America.
The managerial state, the bureaucracy. And I was, a while back, I did an interview. We were talking, and the gentleman made the point that in late 19th century, there were more bureaucrats in Paris than there were all throughout the Russian Empire. Yet the Russian Empire is called autocratic and tyrannical.
Right.
Well, simply, they didn't have the officials to do this. So practically speaking, it couldn't be, because you had mediating institutions and these things to really govern society. And but that's the false claim of liberalism and democracy. Because even at the end of the day, I think I've made this point to you directly and other people, is that we have these paper constitutions, but they don't follow them anyway. They don't even live up to their own claims.
Exactly. Yeah. Why should they? There's another little book that I think his name is Trevor Goodson, I think, but it's a history of central banking, and he goes into that point in terms of the Russian government as well, about what was really going on, and questions of usury and that kind of stuff. But point being is just that I'm trying to say that we think of America as separation of church and state, but actually the religions in America are essentially organs of the state, is what it all amounts to. Which
is what these days Wim Hof makes the point in his book. That was the original plan, was you create this pluralistic society. Everyone has their own religion. They can go to church on Sunday and then become, productive, economically driven robots for the rest of the week. It doesn't really make much of a difference.
Yes. And one of the problems with that is the Enlightenment assumption of what's called neutrality. So in the realm of philosophy, you have this question of philosophical or ideological neutrality. And is that really possible? I don't believe that it is. So, for example, I think it really quickly breaks down because we start asking questions like, well, how can the state be neutral on something like abortion? How can it be neutral on the question of marriage? Those are institutions that relate directly to human society. Mm-hmm. So how can the state have no position or be neutral on those things? It's really retarded and quite childish to think that it could. And yet that is the inheritance that we have from the Enlightenment, is the assumption that not just in science that you can be, quote, neutral, but then in fact in all areas of life there's this magical position of neutrality, that you don't have to take a position, or that you can allow some sort of libertarian freedom in. And in fact, it's just simply not the case. There's no point that in the world or in reality or human life that is neutral. Nothing is, if you stop and think about it. But of course, that's not the pragmatic approach. Is not to stop and reflect, or to to even consider something like that. But, whether it's, Sunday laws, right? There used to be Sunday laws, whether it's, the days of the week, right? I mean, whether it's questions of usury, whether it's questions of morals, abortion, murder, none of these things can be neutral. And it doesn't, I mean, certainly there's such a thing as crazy bureaucracy, but at the same time, there's no such thing as a state that doesn't legislate morality. That's utterly
well. I'm personally opposed, Jay.
Well, that's what it does. Is that I think Wim Hof in a kind of passing point actually makes a brilliant argument there that, well, isn't that what's necessary for commerce? I mean, in other words, to maximize commerce, you need to play down religious laws and distinctions because it's not good for commerce.
Yes.
And that's a key point here, is that the real God of the system is mammon, is the market God. And
that doesn't really, you get to the essential question is what constitutes a good and just society. And
exactly.
But that's not a pragmatic question.
That's philosophical, and that's no longer pragmatic, right?
In America, we like to get things done.
Yeah, and Wim Hof, makes those points right away. And early on in the book, he says that essentially America is the pragmatic country. I also appreciated the chapter too. He discusses at length, the Quigley. Like there's a whole chapter on Rhodes, Roundtable Group, Quigley, Lionel Curtis's Commonwealth of God. Becomes the idea of the Anglo-American establishment.
Yeah, and the whole idea that the American century would be designed by various banker elites who control the media. These are a handful of men, for the most part, who are creating an economic system, which it's called economic freedom, but it benefits the empire.
And the same people that designed the 14 points, it's the same class that designed the 4 freedoms.
Yes.
And they're the same ones that said that this needs to be sold to the entire world. And guess what? They're all bankers, and they drew up all the debts after World War I or World War II.
Another false promise, just like the way the liberal constitutions are false promises, because the 4 freedoms and the 14 points, well, one thing, it didn't apply to defeated Germany in 1918, but later on, it didn't apply to Mossadegh in Iran or Guatemala in 50, under Arbenz or Chile and these things, right? Because the moment you ran afoul, the freedoms,
they're arbitrarily doled out and taken away.
It's again, just freedom. It sounds great, but they don't live up to it.
What about freedom from usury?
Yeah, freedom from usury. Where's
that freedom?
They become institutionalized. But it's when you talk about the use of foundations, NGOs. You could say these organizations you don't really consider governmental. E. Michael Jones in his book, in several books, but particularly in The Slaughter of Cities, and also he wrote a biography of John Cardinal Kroll and the Cultural Revolution, which actually predates The Slaughter of Cities. I read it actually in reverse. I wasn't aware of the Cardinal Kroll biography. But he says there was a basis, it was his research that Cardinal Kroll led to Slaughter of Cities. And sort of, again, we have a situation, this is done in the middle part of the 20th century, because America is a funny situation. I've heard America described as sort of a Masonic Frankenstein monster. It was up until the 20th century, it was largely decentralized, and at least in the outside the South, very ethnic and sort of compartmentalized ethnically, these ethnic enclaves and these things. But this had to be sort of homogenized for the American century. And this really began in World War I, but really began in earnest during World War II.
Correct.
Under the pretext of war measures to bring black sharecroppers up from the South to fill the war factories because of the war mobilization. 12 million men went off to fight. You had this labor shortage. That was a need that had to be met, but it was also used as a pretext to sort of weaken the unions, at the same time also break up these ethnic neighborhoods that people like Paul Blanchard saw as being suspect, loyalty for the war. Even to Polish Catholics or Irish Catholics, it wasn't just Germans or Italians that he targeted, because these Catholic enclaves or ethnic communities were sort of a stumbling block to the post-war plans. I think they were already set in motion. But the use of the foundation, like the Ford Foundation, and the use of one thing later on, you shoot ahead to the 60s, the use of governmental agencies like the Office of Economic Opportunity to fund criminal gangs, sort of as proxy soldiers to chase the whites out. And this is very similar to what we see like in the Middle East with some of these, with ISIS, so-called ISIS, and some of these groups where these proxy forces are used to create mayhem, to achieve some sort of a demographic objective, perhaps.
Guess what? The same thing is happening to the ethnic communities of the Orthodox world.
Yes.
It's no different. And, for example, I was reading an article the other day about, I think it was in one of the Eurasian publications, Journal, NEO, or whatever, but I think I shared it online. It's a good article talking about the bankers' destruction of Greece. Now, we all know that this has happened over the last several years, but the leftist government that was supposedly going to stop and oppose the IMF, oh, well, magically, guess what? They just happened to be people from the IMF and from, Alexei Tsipras or whatever. And guess what he wants? More mosques in Greece. Now, the Greeks, who, of course, fought Muslims at different points in history, and even the Greek bishops in Greece, who are not as bad, by the way, as the American Greek bishops, who are the worst. They're mad. They don't want more mosques. And they're saying, we want borders. We do not want more and more Islamic influx. But guess what? That's to destroy Greece. That's to destroy what's there. It's by design. And it's Muslims there, and it's migrant caravans here. It's the exact same models. And what you're talking about with the ethnic enclaves, with Catholics, it's the exact same thing.
Yeah,
or with Southerners, it's the exact same thing.
And you can achieve a lot of objectives. One thing is you create white America, right? In the post-war white suburbia, which then can be subjected to the Cultural Revolution through the mass media. And this is all spelled out, like you said, in various white papers and think tanks, the creation of suburbia. But the one example is the efforts for the federal government of promoting birth control in the 1960s. It had been defeated in the 1930s because of these Catholic ethnic neighborhoods, and the Catholic Church was strong because of these ethnic neighborhoods. But by the 1960s, the diaspora and the suburbia had been, had happened, and so you had that loss of ethnic identity. But one focal point of this battle was in Philadelphia, where it was the Most Blessed Sacrament Parish, I think it is. Most Blessed Sacrament, MBA, Most Blessed Sacrament Parish. It was like 100 city blocks, very dense. These dense Philadelphia homes, all Catholic. Okay, and it was the largest Catholic school in the country, and provided the most priests and these things. But it also elected a senator, Martin Mullen. And that senator I think, controlled the purse strings of the state budget. And he held the pass against the state of Pennsylvania promoting birth control. And what they did was they gradually integrated his neighborhood, and he lost his district because of that. And the ethnic Catholics left for suburbia. And the problem with the archdiocese is didn't have the sophistication to see what was going on. They didn't seem to care. They just thought integration was good. That was sort of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. If you were progressive, you had to promote integration because you were a racist if you didn't. Right. But they didn't understand that this parish was being destroyed, which is the backbone of the influence of the church. From the standpoint of the archdiocese, they had people who will go out to suburbia, but they're still members of the archdiocese. But they're no longer part of a cohesive, tight-knit community, and there goes the cultural influence of the church. Therefore, its political power. Once these ethnics go in the suburban, they become whites. With watching TV, all they have in common, and it was very sophisticated. But it was done, and how this was done was the employment of foundations, Quaker organizations, the Catholic interracial councils. You had people liberals within the church who either understood this or didn't care. They just wanted to be good liberals. But this, again, you use ethnic warfare, and superficially, it looks good because everyone's supporting integration, but from a political science and sociological standpoint, you're sort of creating this homogenization of society and destroying groups that might present some check on the objectives of the empire. Which one of the things was of course depopulation and birth control, and the courts were there with Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965 to legalize it. What happened was, once the courts ruled it was a right, a privacy right, governments can now go out and actively promote it. Before that, they couldn't promote this thing, and they started promoting it. And I think it was William Ball, who was a Catholic lawyer working for the Archdiocese, made the argument that, well, if it's a right to privacy, then the government is not right even promoting, because you're invading someone's privacy by promoting it. Yeah, but that's just my point. Is that is like kind of a micro example of the importance of sort of these ethnic neighborhoods and how you can achieve a much larger political objective just by demographic warfare, and it's indirect, so it isn't particularly noticed. And the point is the foundations are key to this.
Yes, there are maybe an analogous example. Orthodoxy in America is kind of confusing because there's a lot of different jurisdictions, and the reason for that is because in Orthodoxy there's no position higher than a bishop. If say the Russian Orthodox Church extends missions to America, if it sets up a mission church, then that church has, unless it's granted autocephalous status, it's usually in some way connected to, a Russian bishop or something like that. If the Greeks set up a mission church, the same situation happens. And so there's been a move, for example, I would argue, I used to think it sounded like a good idea to have all of the jurisdictions of Orthodoxy in America united. But now that I understand the way that this stuff actually works, that would be a bad thing, because what would happen is it would all they would try to put it under one single American jurisdiction that would be completely controlled. So that would actually be a nightmare. So it's actually good that we have different parishes, Russian churches, Serbian churches, Romanian Orthodox, all these different types, because that's much more difficult to try to force everybody into the acceptance of one giant so-called canonical thing that's run by, foundations and a bunch of stooges.
Yeah, whenever you do it, you end up with a rainbow flag outside your church anyway. You'll
have to. And yeah. And I remember, 10 years ago, I started looking at Orthodox, and I remember people talking about, we need to have all the jurisdictions united. We need to have one jurisdiction for North America. And ideally, normally that would be the case. But nowadays, given the way I have I think a better picture of how, subversion works, that sounds like a nightmare. We would not want that. But yeah, and that would play into ethnic subversion as well. So you're absolutely right. So and there's different errors here. Like there's the focusing too much on the ethnicity, which happens at times in Orthodoxy and causes problems. But at the same time, that can also be a positive. It can be a firewall. So there's no easy answers to this, because the system that we are opposed to is a system that utilizes mammon to essentially destroy man. And that's the problem, is that people don't see that. And I come back to think about The Godfather, right? And I think Wim Hof has a section where he talks about this, that's an emblem of the destruction of the people group. You see the same idea in Scarface, is you have these people who would have been more traditionally minded in their religious views, and the same would apply to any person who comes to America, to make his way from whatever religious background. The same idea is there, is that the kind of system that America is a system that entices you on the basis of material prosperity. And I thought the chapter that Wim Hof had about Walter Lippmann was especially telling, because it jibes perfectly with what we've covered, for example, at my site in Miles Copeland, because Miles Copeland said, we wanted to sell Hollywood and Americanism, or we wanted to sell Americanism in Egypt, so we just sent them Hollywood movies, because that made them all think that, living the good life is essentially, climbing up the ladder. And you see that that's what it's about. That's what the enticement, that why do all these third world people want to come here? Well, they want to have a better life. They want to make money. But they don't understand that 3 generations from now, that's to turn their offspring into goblins, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good example of that is a lot of the people from Mexico who migrate north.
Exactly.
Once they get away from like Our Lady of Guadalupe, they lose their Catholicism. That's an explicitly Mexican form of Catholicism. That's how they identify with it, and it's not very strong up here, and they become again these. Like you said, goblins.
Well, they want.
Goblins.
I mean, it's not like it's only white people that are going to be promoted with the tranny stuff. It's everybody.
Yeah. Yeah,
and the schools are pushing that, and now Canada has legalized bestiality, so that it's completely legal to have bestiality now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just. I mean, it's like every degeneracy is going to be pushed out and promoted, and it's going to be basically a completely satanic order, is what it is.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And of course, a lot of these countries, particularly Latin America, Mexico, they would invade America's Freemasonic project in Mexico and uprooting the traditional state there in the 19th century. And throughout Latin America,
it was fostered by Masons.
Yeah, Masons, and again, there's a context here that America has played a large role in keeping these countries poor and destabilized. And this is a model here because you do that, you create a virtually endless supply of not only caravans of people who can come up and create social disruption and just create sort of a strategy of tension, but also cheap labor. Cheap labor. It coincides with so-called free trade and these things. They've always leveraged the enslaved or exploited, wretched masses of the colonies or the empire. For labor and call that free trade. And that's something that British Empire did to Germany in the 19th century.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah. And people don't think about it being studied at that level, but there was in fact a UN paper from a couple years. The paper was from early 2000s, I think, but somebody had, it was going around the alt media a few months ago, maybe a few weeks ago, I forget what it was. But basically this UN paper was about population projections for different regions. And they were giving scenarios. It was like 8 different scenarios, and one of those scenarios was basically the displacement of the normative Caucasian population by large amounts of Latin, South American, Mexican, population moving into the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
by, I think they had something like 2040, 2050. So in other words, and now it was presented in this particular UN paper as just one of the many scenarios, right? Like, but no, that's never used as a game plan. They would never use that as like an actual strategy. No. Even though there's books by countless academics like Weapons of Mass Migration, they would never actually use that, right? It's just an objective analysis, Sure. Even though the bankers say we want to, Peter Sutherland, let's flood these countries with, even though Wesley Clark says it's time for all this to go away. No, they would never do that. It's just.
How do Somalians end up in Minnesota?
Or Tennessee? Or in Nashville? I met a guy at a bookstore, and he was a leftist guy. He ran one of the bookstores that closed down, the old bookstore downtown, and he saw me looking through the geopolitics section one day, and he was, "What do you?" There's not many people buy those books. I said, "Yeah." I was looking for anything to do with, I think I said something like Cold War, and he was like, "Oh, well, blah, blah, blah." He said, "Yeah, I've always been anti-war and all this stuff." And he had these kind of like, "Oh yeah, there's a deep state cabal and this kind of stuff. And they, that's who killed JFK." And then he's like, "But yeah, I got to go because I got to go. I volunteer at one of the refugee centers where we are receiving all the Somalians."
Mm-hmm.
I was like, in Nashville, there's all these Somalians coming in. I was like, yeah.
Why? And who's paying for it?
Mm-hmm.
So there's agency. There's agency.
Well, we know who's paying for it.
Yeah,
Soros organizations, but yeah.
Yeah, and they're making money hand over fist doing it too.
That was another big key too. That I think Jesse Russell pointed out in one of your interviews, and actually I looked this up after he mentioned it, and that was a thing I missed too. Was all the virtue signaling about this stuff by these retarded churches, and by the way, it's all of them. There's Orthodox for virtue signaling. The mainline Greeks were. Protestant churches, the liberal ones, obviously, and the Roman Catholic bishops, they were virtue signaling over this because they're getting money for these refugees.
Yeah, this is where the brick and mortar men, as Michael Jones called it, they're busy establishing their churches, but they're not keen to the psychological warfare being waged against their flock. And as he said, so they're bringing knives to gunfights, and they have no understanding. In some cases, I think it might be more sinister than that.
Oh yeah, it would be. Yeah,
someone like a Cardinal Bernardin,
Bernardin or Mahoney. Yeah, these guys are.
He was involved with
wicked.
What's his name in Chicago? The guy who wrote Rules for Radicals.
Saul
Alinsky, yeah. He's working with Saul Alinsky. I'm like, okay. And everywhere it goes, there's a trail of reports of abused children. So whatever whatever you want to infer from that. With you in the talk, you were I think you opened it up with this 36-year interview with Norman Dodd, which is very important, but it's one of these things where Norman Dodd, who was the chief investigator for the Reese Commission, you mentioned earlier, and you alluded to this earlier, is at one point there was a very serious congressional investigation of the role of the foundations. Renee Wormser wrote a book called Foundations and Their Power, and he details this, but there was a very serious investigation on what they were doing, un-American activities, and what Norman Dodd describes as un-American activities, just using unconstitutional methods to change the government or society, which I thought was a pretty fair, explanation of something as vague as un-American. People, but he actually, I'll let you.
Well, the people who are doing this are committed Americanists, and they knew no better, right? They operated on the basis of the light that was given to them. So, they didn't know any better, but it's just like I heard some story about the guy who founded the Birch Society. I forget who he was, some general or something. And, he was well-intentioned, but supposedly he got blown away by the fact that he realized that it was these big foundations. It wasn't just commies. It was like, very wealthy people supporting all this stuff in America, right? So the same principle here is that if you look, for example, at the things that they list that the various foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, blah, blah, it was ideas like relativism, moral relativism, cultural relativism, socialism, this kind of stuff. And that makes perfect sense because if we think about, Yuri Bezmenov, the endlessly cited defector interview, and I think it's G. Edward Griffin. It's G. Edward Griffin that's interviewing Norman Dodd, and it's G. Edward Griffin that interviews Yuri Bezmenov.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that in the Bezmenov lecture, he doesn't ever he says he talks about things that are real subversive techniques. So all that stuff that he says is correct, but I don't think he gives the full story of who's behind it. But if you look at what the findings of the Reese Committee are, that's who it is. It's those people. It's Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, the big bankers, all these families. That's who it is.
Yeah, in that interview, Norman Dodd talks about he was like 30 years old at the time of the Great Crash, 1929. But he was told to investigate it by about banking reform. I think I have the quote here. It's very interesting. He goes, when I was 30 at the time. I had no more right to, much to my surprise, my superiors, in the middle of the panic in which they were immersed, confronted me. I was confronted with the question, Norm, what do we do now? I was 30 at the time. I had no more right to have an answer to that question than the man on the moon. However, I did manage to say to my superiors, gentlemen, you take this experience as proof of something that you do not know about banking, and you better go find out what that something is and act accordingly. 4 days later, I was confronted by the same superiors with a statement to the effect that, Norm, you go find out. And I really was a fool, and I was a fool enough to accept the assignment because it meant that you were going out to search for something and nobody could tell you what you were looking for. I felt so strongly on the subject that I consented to it. I was relieved of all normal duties. I'll paraphrase here. And he went out and he did investigate it and basically came back with a report, I guess, promoting sound banking as the solution. Where is this? Here we go. He says, so I rendered such a report, and as a result of the report I rendered, I was told the following, Norm, what you are saying is we should return to sound banking. And I said, yes, in essence, that's exactly what is that I am saying? Whereupon I got my first shock. Was the statement from them to this effect: "We will never see sound banking in the United States again." And they cited chapter and verse to support that statement. What they cited was as follows: "Since the end of World War I, we have been responsible for what they call the institutionalization of conflicting interests, and they are so prevalent inside this country they can never be resolved. This came to me as an extraordinary shock because these men who had made this statement were the men who were deemed the most prominent bankers in the country. The bank of which I was a part of was spoken of a Morgan Bank. Coming from the men of that caliber, a statement of that kind made a tremendous impression on me." Now, what he's saying from that is that the banking system, the financial system, is made purposely unstable to create occasional shocks for the purpose of, I would say,
the boom bust cycle is a scam that we talked about at one time. Yeah,
and so he's being told that the system is made to be intentionally unstable. They want this is strategy of tension, it's to create a crisis. And this is essentially what occurred with the Great Depression and the other panic. But yeah, I also thought that was an interesting part of that interview. But he says with the Reese Committee, he does this investigation, and he goes up there. I think sends Catherine Casey up to investigate the minutes of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and she discovers a conspiracy to drag the country into war for the purposes of collectivization of the country. They fundamentally changed. Basically, there's no better way to fundamentally change a culture or a country than to drag it into war. And also the subsequent plans to extend the First World War, to extend the crisis, to, create more damage to society, trauma, and then do all things possible, take measures to avoid a reversion to normal times for peacetime.
Yes.
And we call that the 20th century, right? I mean, that's
correct. And the people at the Rhodes Rothschild Society, the elect group that we've covered, that's who cooked all this up, and they're the ones who cooked up the need to bring America into the wars, to be the engine for this, to not only create the instability and to have the villains like Hitler, but to also they're also smart enough and devious enough that they know that the wars will exhaust certain countries. It'll exhaust their enemies, and they even talked about that. In fact, there's a chapter where Quigley talks about that with Italy. He says that what Mussolini did was actually advantageous for the West. Mussolini basically exhausted Italy. They had nothing they could do after the war. Not that Italy was necessarily that great of a war power, but the point is that the Axis powers couldn't. Germany really was the main problem there, as you know, Quigley and E. Muckle Jones and Stratfor, Friedman, everybody agrees that that's what the Royal Society did. Was they came up with a plan to basically wreck Germany, and it worked. And then they did the same thing with Russia. We know we've covered that, but the point is that the people who have these big picture strategy analyses done, they're smart enough to know how to play a big game, is what I'm trying to say. So they know the stuff about migration movements, population movements, how to wreck cultures through that we talked about a few minutes ago. And they know the same strategies with economy, how to sink and cycle economies through different means. That was covered excellently. One of the crucial chapters in Tragedy and Hope that people miss is the FDR chapter, because if you just see FDR as a socialist or a commie, you miss it. You miss the whole thing, because even Wim Hof points out that FDR's four freedoms, that's perfectly in line with the spirit of American capitalism, even though he was a collectivist. And the promotion of collectivism in this regard is not contrary to monopoly capitalism at all.
No.
And when you see the cycles, this was the Quigley chapter on FDR that's so crucial, that the cycles are intentional to have a period of prosperity and privatization that then transitions into a cycle of austerity and collectivization. And the bankers are smart enough that they know that, and they can plan that. And that what that does, as we said, was it collectivizes the debt. The future energy of your children are basically already down payments on future debts. That's how they do it. And they keep you in slavery, not just your generation, but generation after generation after generation. And they can even cycle the economy through different phases of boom and bust. That's how it's done. So it's not a free market. It's a rigged economy, even though it's sold as a free market. It's basically just scam within scam within scam. Mm-hmm. It's like onion layers of scams. I know we talked about that before.
Yeah, and the whole banking financial system and insurance, even healthcare insurance, the debt model, and these things it's all designed for extraction, harvesting.
Exactly, harvesting energy, basically, energy parasites, basically.
Now, I know you talked a lot about Wemhoff's book. I think it would be fair if we talk about that, and because we talk about this doctrinal warfare, and he in the book.
By the way, real quick, can I add something?
Sure.
Do you remember when you and I were talking about the funny chapter in Quigley where he talks about the Bank of England and the secret storage vaults and stuff?
Yeah, the Dr. Evil's gold hoard or something.
And did you see the article that I found that I put up in my James Bond talk where the Queen is walking in the secret vaults looking at her $260 billion in gold? Yeah. Anyway, but yeah.
And she's Goldfinger.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's like her and Lord Rothschild are like, Goldfinger together. The Doctrinal Warfare program, because this spells out what you're talking about. By the way, if you have that much of the gold, I mean, if you remember Goldfinger's plot, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think this plays into, I'm theorizing here, conspiracy theorizing. This plays into manipulation of the gold market. I mean, if you have like the controlling, like a giant chunk of the world, then aren't gold markets manipulated? I mean, Paul Craig Roberts has been arguing this for a long time. Yeah,
so you can't rely on a gold standard.
Right.
Fiat currency gold, because once you're dealing with this level of criminality and bad faith, this goes back to, there's no economic model that can compensate for such criminality and degenerate behavior.
That's a great point. Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to, basically a system has to have a certain degree of integrity and honor to it, and it doesn't, it just collapses. And there's no model that can protect you from it. Because I feel, really, because if you have honorable people running the printing press, even a fiat currency will work if it's backed up by economic production. There's no,
right.
But this Wemhoff book cites this doctrinal warfare program. It was a document titled PSB D33 with annexes, which basically the program was to target intellectuals, business leaders, and clerics in a number of different societies with the goal of having them improve the American ideology and principle. Yes. Psychological warfare is defined further in this interview. Two key aspects of American ideology my book proposes are, I'm reading from Wemhoff's summation, so-called separation of church and state, along the conception of religious liberty with the means that there is not a state-established church and that religion is not to form the basis of public policy, and the freedom of a press which effectively puts culture and real power over the minds of the citizenry in the hands of private concerns like 6 corporations that we now have today.
Wow.
Right? Interlocked corporations.
Yes.
And we see this today because now a lot of Catholics, even the Pope, current Pope, has internalized the American ideology. I think it was in September 2015. He talked about the separation of church and state is the model, and the integral or confessional state simply doesn't work, which is a contradiction.
Right.
Yeah. Of church teachings.
Yeah, I think you could argue that on the side of the papacy, Benedict XV, the beginning of the cracks, because he supported the League of Nations, and of course successors to him were less amicable to this kind of a thing. But yeah, I don't think there's not much debate that from John the 23rd on, you essentially get this line of thinking. I mean, I've read a large portion of the encyclicals of all of the popes after. I've read a lot of the 20th century encyclicals, but I've read John the 23rd. I've read Paul VI. I've read, many of John Paul II's and Benedict, and they all are in unison there about the confessional state's basically done.
Yeah,
it's a relic.
That's it's funny because again, as Americans, we grew up in a in a society where there is no state church.
Right. And ironically for me, I never questioned that until I became a Calvinist. And it was ironically Calvinists of all people that got me questioning that, not because they so much adhered to a confessional state, but in certain strands of Calvinism, you have the idea that the moral law of God has to apply to the civil sphere. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not coherent to try to argue that God has all the attributes that you believe he has, like omnipresence and omniscience, and that all areas of life are essentially under his providence and sovereignty. Well, then it only logically follows that the moral law also extends into all areas of life. And if that is true, which obviously is, then that applies to the civil sphere as well. And as a Calvinist, I was pretty ignorant of church history, but then when I delved into church history, you learn that, well, this is the normative view of the church. The church, even the early church fathers prior to the Christianization of the kingdom, supported the death penalty. They supported the theory of just war, on and on and on. And they did that because of their view of scriptures. They saw a unity between the Old and the New Testaments. They didn't teach Marcionism. And when you read the history of the church, and you see countless kings converted to Christianity, and then essentially setting up Christianity as the confessional religion, that's the norm. And everybody knows this from countless examples in church history. I was just watching a documentary on Byzantium, and Empress Theodora built a giant church to patron saints of the Byzantine army. The army had patron saints. That is not that how far that's night and day from what we're talking about with the idea of essentially the secular atheist state. And by the way, I am going to do eventually Fire in the Minds of Men, and I've read not a lot of. I've read about 5 chapters of Fire in the Minds of Men, and already we're coming to see that Billington is honest in his, and he's an apologist, like he's pro revolutionary America. He's saying basically what Wim Hof is saying is that the spirit of 1776 is the spirit of, he doesn't talk about Vatican II, but he's saying that is the logical end result of the spirit of 1776 is essentially complete religious freedom. God doesn't have anything to do with the civil sphere, blah, 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 blah. But again, whether you're Roman Catholic or whether you're Orthodox, everybody knows that the double-headed eagle is the ancient symbol of the church, and that's because it represents church and state under God.
Yes, Sinfonia, right?
Right, which even it's the same principle in Catholicism too. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire symbol is double-headed eagle. So,
now with of course America itself is different. It's the first state that was established that did have this non-establishment of the church, the separation of church and state, which really isn't in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson.
Right, it's Jefferson and Roger Williams and those Baptist goofballs.
Yeah. So really, obviously, you really can't have that. It's not reason. It's an excuse to sort of purge religious influence from the public square and inject secular humanism or ideology or some secular ideology in there, because nature abhors a vacuum. Someone's values will indeed prevail. It's a question of whose.
However, I don't buy. I used to try to argue that you could read the documents as Christian, but I more and more don't really think you can, because just think about the conglomeration of people that came together to draw them up. I mean, it's essentially ecumenical.
Yeah.
Let's get a bunch of Baptists and Congregationalists and atheists and Satanists and deists and Masons and Episcopalians together and come up with an idea of government.
But nevertheless, the Catholic Church, and Wim Hof writes about this in his book, is the allure of America, I think you alluded to earlier, is that it offers material prosperity, a lot of goodies, a lot of baubles and things, gadgetry and things like that. And so traditionally, we've always been, obviously, man cannot have two masters. What does it profit a man who loses, if he gains the whole world, loses a soul? There's an acknowledgement in traditional Christianity about this temptation. Even Jesus in the desert and these things, being offered all the principalities and powers, dominion over them, and him rejecting it. But what am I getting at here? The idea that the corruption of Americanism vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. This why Americanism pervades the Catholic Church, not just Vatican II, but long before. That's what David Wimhoff writes about. Is that life in America, relative like maybe life in Ireland or even Germany in the mid 19th century, was very nice. Catholics come here. There were restrictions, but they prospered. They did well relative to their cousins back in the old country. So they gained a certain amount of loyalty to America based on their financial prosperity, on their material prosperity. So they became loyal to that. And this was the source, is their material comfort, again, is what makes them Americanists. And so they have to become loyal to the state. And so they start to come to believe that the state being ideal, as opposed to the Catholic Church prior to the 60s, saw the situation in America, sort of the Catholic Church having a practical relationship to what the state was. In fact, the Catholic Church always took a practical approach to what government was in power at the time. Right. And so it said, okay, this is the current situation the way it is. It was somewhat ameliorated by the fact that America was so decentralized. And again, we talked about these ethnic neighborhoods in the North, in the Midwest, and these things. So that had an effect of sort of ameliorating these things. America wasn't quite the empire yet. It became more of a problem when she became an empire in the latter half of the after the Second World, leading into the Second World War. But you have the Catholic Church relation to traditional states like Spain or Portugal, where the church became internally hostile to like Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal, or what happened in Italy in the 1940s. And then, of course, this was Henry Luce, because Henry Luce's wife was the ambassador to Italy. And you talk about, it wasn't just Henry Luce. It was Notre Dame here in America, who was pining for Rockefeller funds, but also this outfit, Pro Dare University in Italy.
Yes, the CIA set up, university, right.
But the point is that the church itself became hostile to confessional or integralist states like Franco's Spain in the name of democracy.
Right, and everybody knows that is the norm in the history of the church. The church is not, and there's 1,000 different lies and made up nonsense that people try to use to justify this. They'll talk about, but the early church was busy Christianizing the empire and dying to make the imperium, Christian, right? So you can't look to, martyrs as if that is the goal. No, the goal, as the prophets predicted many times over throughout the Psalms, throughout major and minor prophets, is that the nations and the kings of the earth would convert to Christ, and they did. And that's one of the reasons we know Christianity is true, is all these prophecies in the law and the prophets and the Psalms predict the fact that the kings of the nations will convert to Christ, and they did. And by the way, their kingdoms converted, and they understood properly and correctly that you can't banish God from the civil sphere. Once you do that, as many wise men have noticed, you get a new God. You don't get secular state, you get a new God. And this is interesting because many of these esotericists and occultists and degenerates, they're more than happy to put a new God into place because you fell for the goofy lie that you would get, no God, you would get neutrality. No, you get a new master, right? No man can serve two masters, which assumes that you're serving one or the other one. There's no neutrality. Jesus has no neutrality in that equation there. So anyway, but yes, it's again, it seems so far-fetched to anybody who grew up in America, the idea of a confessional state, but it's just a fact. That's the reality of the history of the church. It's not an aberration of the early church. That itself, which is what many Protestants, many Americanists rely on, is simply not true. That's a mythology that that Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists really popularized, this idea that Constantine fundamentally changed the constitution of the church into something that it wasn't before, and that's simply not true. You can read countless hundreds of pages of church fathers prior to Constantine who taught the exact same thing as the church fathers after Constantine. They didn't fundamentally change anything. The liturgies were the same. The views of the doctrine of the church are the same. The views of the legality of the state. Paul in Romans 13 says the state has the sword as a minister of God. Now, Paul he's not saying the state is God, and by the mere fact that he lost his head as a martyr
Yeah.
by the state shows that he didn't believe the state could do anything. No, it's limited by the law of God, obviously. And so, the early church had the same view, but they also at the same time recognized the legitimacy of the state to wage just war and to punish evildoers, as Paul says. That's what the sword is. It's the death penalty. This is another element that a lot of people miss too, is pacifism, the pacification. The same problems, by the way, in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy. So what goes along with a lot of this Americanism is also magically the promotion of pacifism. Now they'll talk about how the New Catechism does this, although oddly enough, the New Catechism for Catholics still retains, I think, some weird statement about how it is the traditional position, but the death penalty is no longer needed with, all the modern inventions that we have, or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And of course, John Paul II was a huge crusader against the death penalty. Now, a lot of people don't see this as that big of a deal. I do, because it's a clear example of one of these cases where we can see the banishment of God from the civil sphere as a clear departure from traditional teaching. So whether you're Orthodox or whether you're Roman Catholic, the entire history of the church has affirmed the death penalty. It's never been doubted, except for there might have been some rigorous church fathers, early on, who, by the way, probably weren't sainted. Somebody like Tertullian or somebody like that, who's not a saint, by the way, who might have doubted it. Some of the ascetics might have doubted it. But the normative, conciliar, canonical view is that the Imperium, it's in the Code of Justinian, by the way, who is a saint in Orthodoxy. The death penalty is there. It's in canon law in certain cases. It's been mentioned.
I think it applies to pederast priests.
It used to, absolutely. Yeah. I think even Justinian's code has pederasty as a death penalty. So, yes. So, in other words, one of the things, by the way, that leftists talked about to alter culture, and I'll give you an example. In the Globalist book series, H.G. Wells says this. He says, promote pacifism and the removal of the death penalty. Why would that be? Well, because that is an anti-patriarchal, anti-masculine, it's an alteration in the civil society, which ends up basically rewarding criminals. Because what happens is criminals get basically put up in prison, and society then pays for the criminal.
Yeah, that was the original concept of outlaw was you no longer had protection of the law. Mm-hmm. It wasn't so much you were just outside the law, acting outside the law, as that you were no longer protected by the law. It was a form of extreme ostracism, and then you were no longer, and anyone could do anything they wanted to you.
Well, that would probably be better than the idea of a giant private for-profit penal system by which people can commit heinous crimes, and then taxpayers are punished by having to pay for this guy, which is preposterous. Now, I understand that our system is corrupt, so I'm not saying that we should give all of these evil people in America, like free reign to just kill everybody. Well, but what I'm saying is that just simply speaking, not in terms of every single case, but just considering the doctrine itself, the doctrine of the death penalty. Everything
becomes commodified, or in the United States, even crime, because now Correctional Corporation of America trades on Wall Street.
Yes, but
stock market.
right, and that makes the issue a little more complex. But just on the question of the legality or normativity of the death penalty in terms of traditional theology, there's no question. Mm-hmm. And it's crucial to understand that the 20th century liberal theologians, well, I guess it would kind of begin with the higher critics, but it becomes popularized along with social gospel, and by the socialists, and by the communists, by the Marxists, by the leftists, and by the pacifist capitalist democracy promoters. They all want to get rid of the death penalty, and that's a big piece that a lot of people miss, because it has the effect of essentially creating a completely different. It's just part and parcel of the idea that God's not involved in the civil sphere. That you have a public, agreed upon, ecumenical view, and then you have your own private religion.
Yeah, it's almost like I've taken a non-spiritual, non-religious example or analogy would be like the right to bear arms, where practically speaking, no one's going to raise arms against the state, but nevertheless, there's something to be said about expecting every man to be armed to be able to protect himself against marauders or criminals. This creates sort of a masculine, manly attitude, and it sort of creates a stronger community, and which adds to self-government. So there's something. It's sort of it's. Well, at times it can be rather practical if someone's breaking your house, but it's also very symbolic, which is why the type of people who defend the death penalty and gun rights tend to be more of a hardier sort, if you know what I mean.
They do, and
the type of people you want as neighbors.
And when you can go through the history of theological texts over the last 2,000 years,
and eat meat,
and they do, yeah, they're not vegan soy boys. In many cases, you'll find that the sources for why you can defend yourself, which again is an application of the death penalty, by the way, is Exodus, because I think it's Exodus 20 or 22 specifically mentions the right of self-defense. And so the normative view of the history of the church was not that, oh, well, that's in the Old Testament, doesn't matter. No, it does matter, because it's a principle of moral law that you have a right to self-defense.
Mm-hmm. But back to David Wemhoff, I don't know if it was in the book or as an interview. I think it was an interview because of the context of what he was talking about. He was talking about, Catholics in America, Catholics who do well in America, who climb up the totem pole, who kind of work their way up the slimy political grease pole and attain power. They all have to shed their genuine Catholicism to attain power or success within the American system. So essentially speaking, you cannot really be a successful Catholic and be a genuinely Catholic in America. You have to compromise yourself. And one example he talks about was when I think it was Amy, who was that? Judicial Amy Barrett was her name, the judicial appointee. She's Catholic, and I think Senator Feinstein was worried about her dogma. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, no Jewish appointee ever gets questioned about the Talmud. And does the Talmud affect your jurisprudence? These things. This is something the double standard we get. Catholics are always confronted with this question by liberal Jewish senators on the Judiciary Committee in confirmation, and no one ever questions them about their dogma or their doctrine, which is abortion and pornography, but it's a whole other issue. But he says, she got a lot of flack for that, and the typical people like Donahoe, the Catholic, what's his outfit?
Yeah, I know you're talking about the organization that it's like a watchdog thing.
Yeah, you're bigoted against Catholics, blah blah blah. It says, but his point was, in a way, the senator was correct. There is something about essential or true Catholic doctrine that is inconsistent with the American system. And
yeah, of course.
And so Catholics, in a way, even American Catholics, their proper role in America is not to have a place at the table. It's there to be outside and maybe wagging a finger and at the very least exerting some sort of influence. But the moment they try to succeed in America, they lose their identity and what essentially makes them Catholic. And we see that with Americanism. Wouldn't you agree?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, people don't get that anymore because, we see every Catholic politician is a sellout. Right? I mean, one degree or another. Even Santorum, the warmonger, for Sheldon Adelson, it's like,
power in America requires money, and money requires you to give up principles.
So the only real is relative poverty But this is that good life. Again, this is what William talks about. The seduction of America is the good life, and you can do well here. And because of that, even priests with their brick and mortar, that's what they worry about. The bishops, they worry about their operations. And as long as they don't lose their tax status, they won't be militant. Well, if the church isn't militant, it's nothing.
Yes. And 501c3 was a long-time scam too, which a lot of people don't know. But that was a way for the government to trap churches into not having political speech.
I think that was the Johnson administration that did that when that was created, if I got that correct.
But going along with the 501c3 tax exempt status also means you're accepting Americanism, because you're accepting that I'm not going to apply my theology to the civil sphere.
Yes. But they can apply their theology,
and they will, absolutely,
to everything.
Right.
And witness how Obamacare makes the Catholic Church everyone's worried about freedom of religion. They're upset because Obamacare was going to make the Catholic Church, subsidize abortion and birth control, and what they describe as reproductive health.
Trannies, like taxpayers are going to be paying for trannies. So
yeah.
you thought morality won't be legislated, but no, it will be legislated, and you'll be supporting the most satanic stuff imaginable.
Now, the role of foundations. I'm going to, if you bear with me, I'm going to read this and get your comment. This is Michael Jones's book, John Cardinal Kroll and the Cultural Revolution. This was a great sort of a synopsis or summation of how foundation. He says foundations really constitute what he calls a secret government.
Sure.
They undermine real government, and I'll read it. It says Renee Wormser, Reese's legal assistant, throughout the hearings, documented in a book published in 1957 not only the dangers posed by foundations to the institutions of the Republic, but also the influence those foundations and their political allies were bringing to bear on the nation's cultural institutions. The great foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, were for the most part founded as a result of the New Deal as an attempt to prevent the flow of family money into the coffers of the federal government under the tax policies instituted by Roosevelt. Created from the wealth of this country's major capitalists, the foundations soon applied the techniques of the cartel, and the trust to the flow of information and reconfiguration of culture. The foundations would put up money which would serve as venture capital in the politics of change. Foundations like those run by the Rockefeller brothers would fund projects like Kinsey sex surveys, which would have been otherwise impossible to support given the constraints of democratically elected government, or the simple satisfying of market forces. The foundations would fund research which they found congenial and almost invariably involved instigating social change away from a position of congruity with the moral law. They involved more than often than not, as the Keynesian studies did, the substitution of scientific data for moral principle. And then when the project had received a modicum of public acceptance, the foundations would turn the funding of the projects over to the government. This was by and large the mechanism of cultural revolution in this country. The foundations would fund the undermining of some law, generally having to do with sex, the family morals, or religion. The courts would remove any legal roadblocks, and the press would proselytize for whatever social change entailed, given widespread dissemination of the scientific surveys, which the foundations funded, and eventually the government would set up programs based on what the foundations proposed, funded by government money, of course. The government's involvement in contraception is one of the instances of general rule that we will examine in greater detail later. But I thought that was a great description of sort of this closed loop that appears sort of dynamic and free, but it's all a closed system.
It is, yeah. It reminds me of not too long ago, a couple of years ago, flipping through NPR. I don't ever listen to it, but I just happened, after never listening to NPR, just one day randomly flipping to it, and I hear this ad for vaccines, and it was talking about how it was something like just kind of mind blowing. I don't remember exactly what the ad was, but something like, be sure to get vaccines because we're trying to really help the world's population to stabilize. And I'm not joking. I was like,
it's like Bill Gates' admission.
And it was said paid for by the Gates Foundation. And so it was like a 2-minute blurb about how everybody getting vaccines will help world population to stabilize. And, we of course, we know Bill Gates says that, in his TED Talks, he's talked about it openly before that the vaccines are intended to do this. But this was not geared towards the third world. It was geared towards domestic population. Like he's saying, you guys in America, please get your vaccines. And he talks about the death penalties and all that. So again, not surprising, but it was just interesting to just randomly turn on NPR and hear that, and then hear the Gates Foundation, paying for this ad. And what was it? Somebody said something about Oprah. And Oprah having a abortion parties. So what Oprah's trying to promote is instead of women feeling shame for getting abortions, having abortion parties. You can't make this up. Oprah is promoting women having abortion parties, like you were having like a baby shower.
What gift do you bring to that? Like an empty pair of shoes or something?
Yeah, it's something very macabre, obviously.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring that up is because Oprah. Yeah, and there's a hashtag for it, shout your abortion or something. But Oprah, she attends one of those yearly meetings with Rockefeller and Bill Gates and all that about third world and depopulation and all that. So the point I'm saying is that yes, they will even openly say that this is done to it's done under the cuff, but it's done in plain sight. But the foundations are able to subvert the normal channels of government because they're not under government purview. So, and that's been the case, for a long time, all the way back there.
They also fund the education system, the colleges, universities, and even Norman Daw talked about that way back.
Yes,
then.
That's that's why I was bringing that into Fordham University and them trying to, influence Orthodox churches on their sexual morals.
And everything is like, apparently you're tyrannical evil if you don't support the big gay agenda. That seems to be the big push. Everything is just gay everywhere.
You're a bigot,
yeah, and it's just not that the flags, but if you go headlines and news stories that are selected in these things, even celebrities, reports of celebrity lifestyles. Of course, celebrities have always been used to degrade and promote degenerate behavior.
But what you were reading from E. Michael Jones there, that jives very well with McGowan. So, Dave McGowan's talking about kind of the Pentagon intelligence angle of it. And he's talking about the foundations driving the counterculture, and it makes perfect sense because it's the same people, controlling the Pentagon who are in these foundations.
Yeah. And they're the ones that flooded the country with LSD.
Exactly.
Which is now common knowledge. People still don't make that connection. There's a documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. And it talks about the free speech movement in Berkeley 64, 65, and it's kind of all clean cut and everything. But by 1969, everyone's just these, zombified hippies, and they're interviewing the people, and all their memories are of all the sex they had. And that's it. So a serious sort of sober anti-war movement that could shine some light and criticism on the system was again destabilized or destroyed by of course degenerate sex, which is
yes, that reminds me too, since we've talked, I covered Boert's book in total. Did you hear those?
Yes, I did. Yeah, Walter Boer.
Yes, and he backs up all that too. He actually talks about the Tim Leary essentially being commissioned to create a cult, like create the Tim Leary cult, and Leary was able to sell his nonsense through saying it was a right. You have a right to this. The exact same thing the way abortion was sold. This is your right, and the man is keeping you down.
Yeah.
It's, in other words, even it's, once again, there's another testament to counterculture being essentially establishment driven. That's the overall thrust of the Boer book is to back up that thesis.
Yeah, the sort of this the big antinatalist push, which is not done sort of directly through forced abortions like in China, where they could get away with it, and one child policy, but just through the cultural change, sort of the culture, the changing expectations, where again women are supposed to, it's just presumed that a woman who goes to college and doesn't want to get married, she wants to have a career. Well, to what end? To what end?
Right, which is the idea of the creation of the narcissistic individual, which is again another psychological warfare technique to create the completely self-centered kind of sociopathic, psychopathic individual, which is a big part of what social media is now doing. You have even I'm sure you've heard this, the executives coming out saying, oops, sorry, we created a giant narcissism machine that destroys society. Sorry about that. Oops. Sorry about that, by the way.
It's like, oops, we created a drug culture. Oops.
Oops, yeah, sorry, we didn't mean to do that.
Vietnam was a mistake.
Yeah.
Oops. Yeah. We dropped 250 tons of bombs on Cambodia. Oops. Yeah. It's like, we're just so stupid. What can we do? But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where, once... again, you ask yourself what constitutes the good society, And look how it's come on. I mean, I was just thinking about this the other day. All these corporately owned daycare centers. They're probably are owned by corporations that are traded on on the stock market. There are people who invest in these things in their 401ks, and they may even be kind of against that, but they're investing in these corporations that are making money on dysfunctional or family dissolution. But it's become corporatized, become a profit, because the culture has been changed where this is so prevalent now that you can have corporations that are based on dysfunctional or warehouse children. And it just feeds itself. It's the same way that corporations are capitalized by the drug money that's being flown in that's being smuggled into the communities. What Catherine Austin Fitz talks about.
Right. Yeah, I want to get to the John McCloy book, the Politics of Heroin, eventually, which deals with all that. But yeah, you start to realize that there's a scientific technique to all these areas. Yeah, I mean, it really is a full spectrum system. Like Engdahl talks about, it's every one of these areas has a very specific. Well, the reason that they're able to do that is, I don't know if you saw in one of the talks, I think it was in the talk that you're talking about there, the Subversion. I showed that graph that shows all the media people. That's a really helpful graph because people have a hard time with understanding this kind of stuff if they're new to it, or if they're, well, what's this Bilderberg group? How does it relate to the CFR? How does that relate to the Royal Society or whatever? Well, it's all the same people in different groups, different steering committees. And if you look at the fact that all the heads of every major media corporation that's the mainstream media, it's all the same people in the Bilderberg group, and it's all the same people in the CFR who are also Trilateral Commission. They're all in the exact same circles. I mean, it was a brilliant thing that whoever put that together, but
people ask you, is there a conspiracy? And you say, well, they're meeting here.
Yeah, right.
I mean, they're coordinating. Okay, they're not conspiring. They're coordinating. Is that a better word for you? Has the CIA ruined that term yet? But even you said to talk about conspiracy theory. But then there are official conspiracy theories that are marketed. I don't know, like the Cold War.
Yeah, George Kennan, right, and Henry Luce,
Mr. X. I mean,
they christened the new conspiracy, which would be the Cold War and the Dulles brothers, right?
Usama bin Laden, Al Qaeda. That's a conspiracy theory.
Yes, 9/11 is a conspiracy. What's more? There was another one that was more recent than 9/11. That was an official condone. Oh, Russiagate.
Yeah,
Russiagate's an official condoned conspiracy theory.
So again, they're one you can believe in. Some are more. I guess some conspiracy theories are more equal than others. In this
UFOs, aliens. That's a government condoned conspiracy theory. That's retarded.
It's actually been promoted by the government.
Exactly. Absolutely.
We know about going in and deceiving people about that to get that going.
I think I put that quote in the book too. That great Brookings Institute quote about UFOs, basically seeing if that would be a way to move people away from Christian.
Yeah, that
ethos. I think I did stick that in the book.
And it does, because people, again, it almost like, what do they call it? It's the second coming. Their idea is what? Disclosure, I guess? Is there a form?
Yeah. It would fit very well into a lot of New Age. And as we pointed out, as I've said, we're seeing a lot of the former new atheists now that new atheism is kind of dying in popularity. A lot of those people are moving into the ideas of the metaphysical, right? Oh, maybe Dawkins says aliens put us here, right? Maybe panspermia is the way to go. So you can see how people can be transitioned out of materialism, because it's not, the human heart is going to worship something. It always will. It doesn't do very well with rank materialism. So, materialism is more like a phase to get people out of, more traditional religious beliefs. And then they're willing to, they're primed, they're putty for the acceptance of some new garbage.
And what's funny is usually it first gets trashed with when traditional religion gets marginalized is objective morality, which again is a stumbling block to the oligarchs.
Then, however, you suddenly get an extremely objective morality about trannies and gays, and funny how we were supposed to not have objective morality, but now we're dogmatically commanded, on all these
Yeah.
moral points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we talked about that before.
Yeah. But the thing is that the cultures, it's very hard to sort of reverse these things, because when you start pointing out things like the normalization of daycare to earning families, if the families are still intact, these things is you're stepping on a lot of people's toes, their lifestyle, their expectations, and what they should be, and they take offense to that. So it's hard to talk about that. They don't want to consider the fact that perhaps they themselves been engineered or manipulated.
The normalization of gay care.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's another thing is
that's what it's going to be.
Well, it will, because that'll be infested if it hasn't already. You've heard reports about the Pentagon's daycare center and these things. What's going on there?
Right.
It's Presidio. Yeah. Again, you warehouse kids, and it's you warehouse kids, and it's easy to socially engineer them and subject them to these things. Even schooling with vaccinations. We just take for granted how we were all schooled growing up. These large, centralized buildings where, we're subjected to this nonsense. Is this normal? Is this really healthy? And you realize who designed the school system, right? I mean, it's like,
yeah, well, it's Prussian model that mixes
yes.
Pavlov and Skinner.
Yeah, Skinner, Pavlov, and Dewey. These people who are malevolent. Well, Jay. We're coming up on an hour 40 minutes. Anything else? Do you want to cover anything else? Did we miss anything? Or
no, that was a good talk. I think the essence of the thrust of the point was just that what we're seeing in the Ukraine and in the Orthodox world is the same pattern of subversion that Wim Hof talks about in Catholicism. It's happened in all the churches, and that's crucial to understand, because we talk a lot in alternative media about politics or geopolitics, or we talk about subversion of culture, toxic culture, but we have to understand that it also applies from the controller's vantage point to churches. That's a big part of it too. Yeah,
a lot of people who are into this type of research sort of don't. They don't consider the importance of the churches. In fact,
right, exactly.
The fact some people think that they should just go away, and they're actually part of the tyranny. But it's much more they're infiltrated and manipulated, so it's a bit more complicated than that.
Right.
Right. Really, to understand what the role the Vatican plays now, I couldn't give you a clear answer.
Too, I'd like to add that might dishearten some people, because they might say, well, if the churches are bad too, then what's the point? Who cares? Give up. Now, keep in mind that throughout the history of the church, there have been many state actors that have attempted to control the church and failed. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I point out about Orthodoxy is that in the history of the emperors, many of them were heretical. Many of them attempted to completely change the doctrine of the church, and the fact that the church did not lose its doctrine of the divinity of Christ and the Nicene Creed, the basis of the Nicene Creed, mm-hmm. I think shows that the protection of God. Like if it was just a human social institution, it would have been turned bad long ago. Yeah. When you had basically, for example, iconoclast emperors, right? Before the Seventh Council, you had emperors basically trying to remove all the icons from all the churches and enact a kind of Islamic style doctrine or something, iconoclasm. And, that didn't win. It's amazing it didn't win out. You had Arianism, in the 4th century, when almost the entire empire was Arian or semi-Arian, except for St. Athanasius and a few bishops, and they ended up winning. So just because, you have the minority opinion, or because the state is trying to control the church, that's not a reason for being disheartened, is what I'm trying to say, because there are many cases in church history, and the state did not win.
Yeah, there's an account in the Bible that E. Michael Jones referenced when he was presented with that very question about the problems within the church. It's the account of when Jesus is on a boat with the apostles on the sea, and a storm comes, and the water's churning, the boat's about to tip over, and Jesus is sleeping.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Finally, they wake him up with, Master, why aren't you sleeping? And then he calms the waters. But the whole point is that right now we're in the middle of a storm.
Absolutely.
And so it seems that way. And maybe from our own standpoint, this is people. There have been martyrs, and this, to a certain extent, this is because people have to suffer for their faith, for their beliefs, for their principles, and so it isn't always going to be easy to stand up to what you think is right, what you know is right, and if it were the case, it'd be easy, but it isn't.
Right, so, right. The Christianization of the empire took 3 centuries of martyrs. So absolutely. And one other thing I would add too is, we can draw a lot of insight from the Old Testament as well. A clear parallel would be the very degenerate history of Israel when Jeroboam had basically set up a giant state-run sex cult. The worship at Dan and Bethel, which was the state erected cult that was set up as a way for him to control the northern kingdoms of Israel, as opposed to the legitimate worship, which was in Judah in the southern kingdom, where it was supposed to be at the temple. There's a lot of wisdom in that, because his state-run sex cult, pretty much took over. And, if you know the history of Israel, this is what led to the Assyrian captivity in the north, and then the Babylonian captivity in the south. So the point is that it leads you into bondage, and the chastisement of the period of bondage is what, of course, purged that away. And, it leads to a better state down the road. So, don't lose heart.
Yeah. So, well, Jay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Of course, it's Jay Dyer, Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. Author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, and also the soon-to-be-released Esoteric Hollywood II sometime next month.
Correct. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. I'll let you go, and I'll post this soon. When I do, I'll send you the link.
All right, Tim. Have a good night.
Good night, then. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.